Skulking Permit by Robert Sheckley. The folks of New Delaware haven't heard from Earth in more than 200 years. Now they've been informed that representatives of Imperial Earth are coming to inspect their tiny village to see if they're bona fide humans or reverted to something alien, something not to be tolerated anywhere in the universe. For 2 weeks, they have been scrambling to make their village meet Imperial Earth standards, building a church, a jail, and a schoolhouse, something they have never needed before, and paving their smooth dirt roads with gravel, something very hard on bare feet. Now all they need is a chief of police and a criminal, because all the history books say Earth has always had crime and punishment. Tom Fisher has been chosen by the mayor to be their criminal. All he has to do is steal a bunch of stuff and commit a murder. It takes Tom a while to get the hang of this stealing business. It all seems so senseless. Find out in episode 2 how he manages murder.
Episode 2. Max Weaver and his wife and 5 children were at the next bench. Tonight, they were displaying 2 blankets and a shirt. They all smiled shyly when Tom came over, followed by the crowd.
That shirt's about your size.
Max wished the people would go away and let Tom work. Tom picked up the shirt. The crowd stirred expectantly. A girl began to giggle hysterically. Tom gripped the shirt tightly and opened his loot bag.
Just a moment.
Billy Painter pushed his way through. He was wearing a badge now, an old earth coin he had polished and pinned to his belt. The expression on his face was unmistakably official.
What were you doing with that shirt, Tom?
Why, I was just looking at it.
Just looking at it, huh?
Billy turned away, his hands clasped behind his back. Suddenly, he whirled and extended a rigid forefinger.
I don't think you were just looking at it, Tom. I think you were planning on stealing it.
Tom didn't answer. The telltale sack hung limply from one hand, the shirt from the other.
As police chief, I've got a duty to protect these people. You're a suspicious criminal character. I think I'd better lock you up for further questioning.
Tom hung his head. He hadn't expected this, but it was just as well. Once he was in jail, it would be all over. And when Billy released him, he could go back to fishing. Suddenly, the mare bounded through the crowd, her skirt flapping wildly around her ankles.
Billy, what are you doing?
Doing my duty, Mayor. Tom here is acting plenty suspicious. Well, the book says.
I know what the book says. I gave you the book. You can't go arresting Tom, not yet.
But there's no other criminal in the village.
I can't help that.
Billy's lips tightened.
The book talks about preventive police work. I'm supposed to stop crime before it happens.
The mare raised her hands and dropped them wearily.
Billy, don't you understand? This village needs a criminal record. You have to help too.
Billy shrugged his shoulders.
All right, Mayor. I was just trying to do my job.
He turned to go. Then he whirled again on Tom.
I'll still get you. Remember, crime does not pay.
He stalked off.
He's overambitious, Tom. Forget it. Go ahead and steal something. Let's get this job over with.
Tom started to edge away toward the green forest outside the village.
What's wrong, Tom?
I'm not in the mood anymore. Maybe tomorrow night.
No, right now. You can't go on putting it off. Come on, we'll all help you.
Sure, we will. Steal a shirt, Tom. It's your size, anyhow.
How about a nice water jug, Tom?
Look at these squeegee nuts over here.
Tom looked from bench to bench. As he reached for Weaver's shirt, a knife slipped from his belt and dropped to the ground. The crowd clucked sympathetically. Tom replaced it, perspiring, knowing he looked like a Butterfingers. He reached out, took the shirt, and stuffed it into the loot bag. The crowd cheered. Tom smiled faintly, feeling a little bit better.
I think I'm getting the hang of it.
Sure you are.
We knew you could do it.
Take something else, boy.
Tom walked down the market and helped himself to a length of rope, a handful of skeegee nuts, and a grass hat.
I guess that's enough.
Enough for now. This doesn't really count, you know. This was the same as people giving it to you. Practice, you might say.
Oh,
Tom was disappointed.
But you know what you're doing. The next time it'll be just as easy.
I suppose it will.
And don't forget that murder.
Is it really necessary?
I wish it weren't. But this colony has been here for over 200 years, and we haven't had a single murder. Not one. According to the records, all the other colonies had lots.
I suppose we should have one. I'll take care of it.
He headed for his cottage. The crowd gave a rousing cheer as he departed. At home, Tom lighted a rush lamp and fixed himself supper. After eating, he sat for a long time in his big armchair. He was dissatisfied with himself. He had not really handled the stealing well. All day he had worried and hesitated. People had practically had to put things into his hands before he could take them. A fine thief he was, and there was no excuse for it. Stealing and murdering were like any other necessary jobs. Just because he had never done them before, just because he could not see any sense to them, that was no reason to bungle them. He walked to the door. It was a fine night, illuminated by a dozen nearby giant stars. The market was deserted again, and the village lights were winking out. This was the time to steal. A thrill ran through him as he thought that. He was proud of himself. That was how criminals planned, and this was how stealing should be: skulking late at night. Quickly, Tom checked his weapons, emptied his loot suit sack, and walked out. The last rushlights were extinguished. Tom moved noiselessly through the village. He came to Roger Waterman's house. Big Roger had left his spade propped against a wall. Tom picked it up. Down the block, Mrs. Weaver's water jug was in its usual place beside the front door. Tom took it. On his way home, he found a little wooden horse that some child had forgotten. It went with the rest. He was pleasantly exhilarated. Once the goods were safely home, he decided to make another haul. This time he returned with a bronze plaque from the mayor's house, Mar Carpenter's best saw, and Jed Farmer's sickle. Not bad, he told himself. He was catching on. One more load would constitute a good night's work. This time, he found a hammer and a chisel in Ron Stone's shed and a reed basket at Alice Cook's house. He was about to take Jeff Hem's rake when he heard a faint noise. He flattened himself against a wall. Billy Painter came prowling quietly along, his badge gleaming in the starlight. In one hand, he carried a short, heavy club. In the other, a pair of homemade handcuffs. In the dim light, his face was ominous. It was the face of a man who had pledged himself against crime, even though he wasn't really sure what it was. Billy held his breath. Tom held his breath as Billy Painter passed within 10 feet of him. Slowly, Tom backed away. The loot sack jingled.
Who's there?
When no one answered, he turned a slow circle, peering into the shadows. Tom was flattened against a wall again. He was fairly sure Billy wouldn't see him. Billy had weak eyes because of the fumes of the paint he mixed. All painters had weak eyes. It was one of the reasons they were moody.
Is that you, Tom?
Tom was about to answer when he noticed that Billy's club was raised in a striking position. He kept quiet.
I'll get you yet.
Well, get him in the morning.
Jeff Ham shouted from his bedroom window.
Some of us are trying to sleep.
Billy moved away. When he was gone, Tom hurried home and dumped his pile of loot on the floor with the rest. He surveyed his haul proudly. It gave him a sense of a job well done. After a cool drink of guava, Tom went to bed, falling at once into a peaceful, dreamless sleep. Next morning, Tom sauntered out to see how the little red schoolhouse was progressing. The Carpenter boys were hard at work on it, helped by several villagers.
How's it coming?
Fair. I'd come along better if I had my saw.
Your saw?
After a moment, he remembered that he had stolen it last night. It hadn't seemed to belong to anyone then. The saw and all the rest had been objects to be stolen. He had never given a thought to the fact that they might be used or needed.
Do you suppose I could use the saw for a while? Just for an hour or so.
I'm not sure. It's legally stolen, you know.
Of course it is. But if I could just borrow it.
You'd have to give it back.
Well, naturally, I'd give it back. I wouldn't keep anything that was legally stolen.
It's in the house with the rest of the loot.
Mar thanked him and hurried after it. Tom began to stroll through the village. He reached the mayor's house. The mayor was standing outside staring at the sky.
Tom, did you take my bronze plaque?
I certainly did.
Oh, just wondering.
The mayor pointed upward.
See it?
Tom looked.
Oh, what?
Black dot near the rim of the small sun.
Yes. What is it?
I'll bet it's the inspector's ship. How's your work coming?
Fine.
Tom was a trifle uncomfortable.
Got your murder planned?
I've been having a little trouble with that. To tell the truth, I haven't made any progress on it at all.
Come on in, Tom. I want to talk to you.
Inside the cool, shuttered living room, the mayor poured 2 glasses of guava and motioned Tom to a chair.
Our time is running short. The inspector may land any hour now, and my hands are full.
She motioned at the interstellar radio.
That has been talking again. Something about a revolt on Dang 4, and all loyal Earth colonies are to prepare for conscription. Whatever that is. I never even heard of Dang 4, but I have to start worrying about it, in addition to everything else.
She fixed Tom with a stern stare.
Criminals on Earth commit dozens of murders a day and never even think about it. All your village wants of you is one little killing. Is that too much to ask?
Tom spread his hands nervously.
Do you really think it's necessary?
You know it is. If we're going earthly, we have to go all the way. This is the only thing holding us back. All the other projects are right on schedule.
Billy Painter entered wearing a new official blue shirt with bright metal buttons. He sank into a chair.
Kill anyone yet, Tom?
He wants to know if it's necessary.
Of course it is. Read any of the books. You're not much of a criminal if you don't commit a murder.
Who will it be, Tom?
Tom squirmed uncomfortably in his chair. He rubbed his fingers together nervously.
Well?
Oh, I'll kill Jeff Hearn.
Billy Painter leaned forward quickly.
Why?
Why not?
What's your motive?
I thought you just wanted a murder. Who said anything about a motive?
We can't have a fake murder. It has to be done right. And that means you have to have a proper motive.
Tom thought for a moment.
Well, I don't know Jeff well. Is that a good enough motive?
The mayor shook his head.
No, Tom, that won't do. Better pick someone else.
Let's see. How about George Waterman?
What's the motive?
Well, I don't like the way George walks. Never did. And he's noisy.
The mayor nodded approvingly.
Sounds good to me. What do you say, Billy?
How am I supposed to deduce a motive like that? No, that might be good enough for a crime of passion, but you're a legal criminal, Tom. By definition, you're a cold-blooded, ruthless, and cunning character. You can't kill someone just because you don't like the way he walks. That's silly.
I'd better think this whole thing over.
Tom stood up.
Don't take too long. The sooner it's done, the better.
Tom nodded and started out the door.
Oh, Tom, don't forget to leave clues. They're very important.
All right.
Tom left. Outside, most of the villagers were watching the sky. The black dot had grown immensely larger. It covered most of the smaller sun. Tom went to his place of low repute to think things out. Ed Beer had apparently changed his mind about the desirability of criminal elements. The tavern was redecorated. There was a large sign reading "Criminal's Lair." Inside, there were new, carefully soiled curtains on the windows, blocking the daylight and making the tavern truly a dismal retreat. Weapons hastily carved out of soft wood hung on one wall. On another wall was a large red splotch, an ominous-looking thing, even though Tom knew it was only Bill Painter's rootberry red paint.
Come right in, Tom.
Ed Beer led him to the darkest corner in the room. Tom noticed that the tavern was unusually filled for the time of day. People seemed to like the idea of being in a genuine criminal's lair. Tom sipped a Pericola and began to think. He had to commit a murder. He took out his skulking permit and looked it over. Unpleasant, unpalatable, something he wouldn't normally do, but he did have the legal obligation. Tom drank his Pericola and concentrated on the murder. He told himself he was going to kill someone. He had to snuff out a life. He would make someone cease to exist. But the phrases didn't contain the essence of the act. They were just words. To clarify his thoughts, he took big red-headed Mar Carpenter as an example. Today, Mar was working on the schoolhouse with his borrowed saw. If Tom killed Mar, well, Mar wouldn't work anymore. Tom shook his head impatiently. He still wasn't grasping it. All right, here was Mar Carpenter, biggest and, many thought, the pleasantest of the Carpenter boys. He'd be planing down a piece of wood, grasping the plane firmly in his hand, his large freckled hands, squinting down the line he had drawn, thirsty, undoubtedly, and with a small pain in his left shoulder that Jan druggist was unsuccessfully treating. That was Mar Carpenter. Then Mar Carpenter sprawled on the ground, his eyes glaring open, limbs stiff, mouth twisted, no air going in or out his nostrils, no beat to his heart, never again to hold a piece of wood in his large freckled hands, never again to feel the small and really unimportant pain in his shoulder that Jan druggist was. For just a moment, Tom glimpsed what murder really was. The vision passed, but enough of a memory remained to make him feel sick. He could live with the thieving, but murder, even in the best interests of the village. What would people think after they saw what he had just imagined? How could he live with them? How could he live with himself afterward? And yet he had to kill. Everybody in the village had a job, and that was his. But whom could he murder? The excitement started later in the day when the interstellar radio was filled with angry voices.
Call that a colony? Where's the capital?
This is it.
Where's your landing field?
I think it's being used as a pasture. I could look up where it was. No ship has landed here in over...
Main ship will stay aloft then. Assemble your officials. I am coming down immediately.
The entire village gathered around an open field that the inspector designated. Tom strapped on his weapons and skulked behind a tree, watching. The small ship detached itself from the big one and dropped swiftly down. It plummeted toward the field, while the villagers held their breaths, certain it would crash. At the last moment, jets flared, scorching the grass, and the ship settled gently to the ground. End of episode 2 of Skulking Permit.